You know, so now it's out there. Cat's out of the bag. So there's no going back, for better or worse. Stay tuned for good stuff coming. Here's where we are today on the status quo and why this conversation about data matters. And the reality that when we get greater diversity, both women and our colleagues of color around the table, all of our numbers start to go up. So there's nothing but good things ahead for the organization and the sector that is willing to move in this direction. And I do think we're starting to see a new willingness. So here were our near-term objectives. We knew that we wanted to do something. We weren't probably planning on doing a survey the first year. Turned out to be some good stuff at the conference. So testing interest in a survey, learning what it takes to design and execute well state of the sector survey. We are here to do a good job at collecting data and using that data for positive advocacy purposes, celebrating good case studies, learning from the good organizations, and helping those who are somewhere on the continuum, one of those belonging workplaces, cultures of belonging. We do want to be able to track data over time. So we don't know what last year's numbers would have been because this is the first year. Where it'll start to get interesting is when we collect it a year from now. A source of intelligence to shape the Alliance's advocacy and program activities. And so what might be some of the advocacy initiatives that we as a network want to come together around. One of the ones Emily and I would like to see is the end of non-disclosure agreements. A lot of people don't realize how much the development space uses those to exit women who they find not a great fit, let's put it that way. One of the things we're advocating with the donor agencies that have started to engage with us is please put that on your grant application question. It's not kingdom practice. It's also a way for organizations as they're taking the survey to stop and think, we don't actually have that policy. That's a great idea. Or it introduces ideas to employees to be able to take back to their organizations and say, do we track how much money goes towards leadership development of women versus leadership development of men in the organization? Because that's a key indicator for how well you're preparing your entry-level women, so that what we call the first rung, and making sure we're getting them on the ladder early, so that the pipeline is fully filled with quality and well-developed women by the time it comes to selecting your next vice president, your next CEO. In 2024, maybe 2025, we will start to launch, based on these surveys and based on a set of 6 or 7 indicators, what are the top 5 large Christian NGOs for women to work in, and what are the top 5 small Christian NGOs for women to work in. And so we start to highlight the best-in-class organizations and then study them as case studies. But it also then is a service to our members, because there are still some organizations today that advocate for the Billy Graham rule, that won't hire women into certain positions like country director. But they don't tell you that on the front end. So it's that lack of transparency that will keep you from advancing to a place where you may have originally had in mind. And so one of the other things we want to advocate for is more transparency around their stance towards what roles women can and cannot attain in their organization. And it's completely fine if they want to cling to those theologies and those stances. They're absolutely allowed to do that. That they're private nonprofit organizations, but they should be transparent about it. All right, response summaries. As I mentioned, we got 555 responses. Not all of them were complete. So when we cleaned out the completed ones, we got about 343. When we cleaned out from those completed ones, some of the bogus ones, so people that went on and filled out just gibberish responses and silly responses. One response was how many total board members do you have? And I think somebody put in like 540. But of the clean ones, 186 women, 149 men, 8 didn't want to give their gender. About 88 different organizations represented. 151 of these responses said their agencies were based in the U.S. 173 responses said their agencies were based outside the U.S. Roughly 35 countries were represented in the study. There is an interest for doing this kind of ongoing research from a lot of CEOs that saw that we were doing this study and took the survey. When they saw how comprehensive it was, when they saw how serious it was and the types of questions, they were like, yeah, this is good. But there was also some real intentional resistance. So part of that we completely own, because the short timeline we had to execute and the no budget we had to execute with, we decided to use social media, targeting our, the Accord network, that we can't verify their email addresses to whether they work in the sector. Or they would pick an organization that's in, we had a drop-down list. And so their organization began with an A, and its headquarters was in Albania, so that you could tell they were picking just, the first early drop-down list. There were a couple of those. So there were people that didn't want to have story told. And when you start to dig down into the verbatims, we got some really good insights and some ideas for future from the verbatims, and much more texture to the story. Let me give you an overview of the responses. Then I want to go to the slide that talks about learning for the way forward, because I think that's key. So the highlights that we do feel like we walked away with, 60% of the respondents. So what I zeroed in on for this section were the completed surveys that were completed by women. And I need to do separate data analysis on the male surveys. That needed a bit more cleaning, because in there were what looked to be more bogus responses. But of the women who responded, 186, 60% believe the extent to which the culture of their organization is improving, or not at all, a minimal extent or a moderate extent. So you've got 60% of the people that feel like, no, we're not really improving, or if we are, it's only to a moderate extent. But that means 40% felt like it's improving to a significant extent, and that's good. Again, we'll have a better idea of how good that is 12 months from now when we start to have comparisons. 50% stated that their organizations offered no to minimal leadership development opportunities specifically for women, but that means that 50% do offer, and I think that's really exciting. 50% expressed that their organization was not at all or nominally moving in a positive direction, so that's a bummer. But 50% feel like it is moving in a positive direction, so that's great. 53% believe their organization could be doing much more for gender equality, and this was the sadder one. Of the respondents, about 1/3 reported some form of inappropriate sexual advance made towards them. And that wasn't microaggressions. That was specific inappropriate sexual behavior. And in the survey itself, we listed out what exactly that was, and people then responded to each of the things, whether it happened one time, whether it happened once a year, or whether it's something that's happening more frequently. So I didn't list all that data out, but this would be defined as attempts at sexual relations or sexual activity despite discouraging it from a coworker, offered some bribe or incentive to engage in sex behavior with a colleague, have been threatened with retaliation for not being sexually cooperative, or were touched in a way that made them feel uncomfortable. So the other thing I would like to someday slice through is how much of that is US-based women experiencing that versus field-based women, which is what I'm going to be doing over the next couple months to see how that slices out. So what are we doing for the way forward? What did we learn? Number one, we're not going to execute the survey on social media. We're going to build, we already have great relationships with MICA Global, with Accord, and with the Integral Alliance. So we're going to ask them to help us with their member agencies to really push the survey. And then start to reach out to all of our friends. We want all of them. And if they're afraid of doing it, let's talk about why are you afraid? Because we're not going to be shaming any organization. We will be celebrating the positive ones. And so maybe that's what they're afraid of, not being on that good list. But that's, we need to get over our fear of data. But I do understand their concern in this cancel culture type world. So this is where I want you to be thinking about, if this jazzes you, if this whole conversation jazzes you, we will be expanding our expert participation in the design and test of individual questions to achieve insight goals, reduce possibilities for skewed results, and reduce our bias. And we want to get a much bigger audience of global perspective. As you know, quantitative research takes more time on the front end and then a shorter time in the analysis, because we have all these great tools to help us with data analysis, whereas qualitative research is the other way around. I could walk in tomorrow and do a focus group with a couple of questions and get some good stuff, but it'll take me a month or two to analyze, verbatim text. So I want to start in April of 2023 for an execution of a survey that would happen in around November of 2023. And I'm going to craft a project sheet for this so that people understand what we're doing, and then invite people like you who have backgrounds in quantitative research to the table to help us do it much better than we did this year. But I can then work the networks with all these NGOs to say, hey, would you please really, send this down through your channels, be advertising it once a week for a month, and we'll offer prizes to the organization that gets the most, people in their organization responding, stuff like that. And to offer, hopefully, if we have enough manpower, human power next year, the idea of we get this data, doing some qualitative focus groups and interviews. So those are some of the things that we learned.